Hey there, Sebastian, product manager here at 8base, and today we're going to be talking about multi-tenancy. Essentially, let's break down what we mean when we say single instance multi-tenancy. Really, all it is at the end of the day is meaning that a single application or a single database is serving multiple customers. And when we start to think of that word tenant in the abstract, a customer could be a user, it could be a company, it could be a user account centered around a specific project. There's many different ways based on the application that you're building that tenancy might be, the context of tenancy might change. However, when approaching the architecture of a single instance multi-tenant application in 8base, there's a few tricks that we can show you on how you use a combination of roles and data model to really enable these type of applications to both work as well as work securely and performant for your application. Now, one of the early use cases that really inspired the vision of 8base was to make the development of single instance multi-tenant SaaS applications significantly easier. However, let's just break that down really quickly and talk about what we're saying when we say all those words. When we say single instance multi-tenant, all we really mean is that a single application or single database is able to serve multiple customers. And that is done by making sure that the data is scoped to only a specific tenant. Now, tenant, customer, we can use these words a little bit interchangeably, but what we're really just talking about is the main table or the main record in our database to which all of that tenant's data is logically scoped. Now, in 8base, this is super achievable, and it's a really powerful tool to enable these types of applications because using data model with the roles and permissions engine, we are pretty much able to create any type of multi-tenant data model structure. Now, we're going to jump into 8base and look at a current application that I've set up, or the backend for an application, and talk about how, by default, it kind of already is a single instance multi-tenant database. However, really look through that use case of moving that from supporting multiple users to supporting multiple companies, and then company-specific or tenant-specific settings. So without further ado, let's jump in and see how this works. Okay, cool. So we're going to start here in one of my favorite workspaces, my SuperTasks backend. And once again, start with a simple data model, simple application domain, and then kind of abstract the concept from there so we all have a really solid understanding of what's going on. Now, inside of this application, it is very straightforward. We have a lists table and a tasks table, and there is a list can have many tasks that belong to it. There's a few fields on each table, but we can just kind of forget about that for now. Now, let's talk about this first in the context of single instance, single tenant, right? So that means that this would be an application to only serve one user, which would be, or one customer, which let's just say that's me. That means that for me, I'm using this as my personal note-taking backend, right? And so that means I don't really have to worry about anything other than authentication, because if I can authenticate, I'm the only customer, and so I should be able to see everything in the database because it's all my data. Now, as soon as you change that to needing to support two users or two or more, then suddenly certain tasks belong to one user, certain tasks belong to another user, lists, so on and so forth. And we're probably going to be concerned of making sure that I don't see person A's tasks and person B doesn't see my tasks, or you get what I'm doing there. So that's where we need to start then thinking about, hey, how do we perform this type of scoping to make sure that we are only permissioning certain data to be shown to the right user? Now, I'm sure that most of the applications that you're designing, you're already thinking about in a single instance multi-tenant way, meaning that you have a single application which you have multiple users using, right? So the first thing that we're going to do here is just look at the simplest way of setting up a single instance multi-tenant application using our to-dos backend, which we're first going to migrate it from being a single instance, single tenant application, which it currently is, and move it to being single instance multi-tenant, where the tenant is a user. Now, here in the data model, we already have a users table because that's every workspace gives you that. And so essentially what we're going to do is we're going to first build a relationship between our tasks table, our list table and our users table. So I'm going to drag and drop that over here. and I'm going to say that the relationship here is that every list has an owner, and a owner can have many lists. We're not going to do it the other way around. Once again, you can pretty much create any type of data model you want. So if yours needs to be different, play with the relationships as is necessary. But right now, we're just going to say the user can have many lists. And every list requires, actually, we're going to leave that unchecked right now because I have some dummy data in here. I don't want to have to delete some of that data. So every list belongs to a user. That's what we're pretty much saying. And a user has many lists. I'm going to create that field. Okay. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to go into my list table, and I'm going to update the two lists that I have in here to say that Sam is the owner of this list, and then I'm going to leave this other list blank. Sam does not have on the other list. The other list has no owner. All right, so now we've established a situation, if you think of it kind of in a hierarchy, where we're treating our users table as the top of the hierarchy. That is the tenant. And now everything that is tenant specific trickles down from there. So now we have the users table, which has lists, and lists have tasks. And we actually know that a task belongs to a user, not because they created that record, even though that could be one way of doing it, but because that record trickles right back up to that tenant's table. Now that our data model is set up, we need to now reflect our roles on the API to accommodate that. So I'm going to go here to the app services, and I'm going to click to our user role, or you create a user role. And here now we're going to be able to set those permissions, right? So things like creating records, we want our users to do that, right? So we want them to be able to create lists and create tasks. However, we now want to make sure that they are only seeing or updating or deleting the tasks and lists that are relevant to them or that they own. Now, it could be confusing, all right, or this would actually work by just saying the user's records, because every record has a relationship to the user that created it, right? However, that's actually not going to work for us. And the reason being is because we want to be specific about how that record is related to the tenant, not just the fact that a certain user created it. So what we're first going to do is we're going to jump into our list table. And here we're going to create a custom filter. Now, when I open that filter, what I want to do here is say that, hey, a user can only see a list if they are the owner of that list. So that means that if they send a query to the API and say, hey, show me all the lists, the API is only going to return the ones that they are the owner of. And I can do that by saying that only allow a list to be read if this filter passes, this custom filter passes. The owner is self. So that means that you are the owner of that list. Cool. And if you're confused at all about what we're doing here, we have two other videos that really kind of break down roles and permissions as well as custom filters. I will link them in the video description so you can jump in there, get familiar, and then come right back to where we are. Now I'm going to copy that as well as save that and drop that right over here for the update permission as well. You can only update the list if you are the owner. Now, before I save it, one thing I just want to mention is that you can have multiple relationships on any record, right? So these types of filters can be a lot more dynamic than this. You could say that one person's an owner, but you could also assign someone as a manager. All these types of configurations are totally feasible. And save that. Cool. So now our list table is properly set up with our users table, treating the users table as the tenant record. Awesome. Now we want to look at tasks. Now, once again, the way that we want to relate tasks to our tenant is through their relationship to the lists table. So we only want a person to be able to read tasks or update tasks if it belongs to a list of which they are the owner. So we're going to do the exact same thing with the custom filter, but now on the task table. Go to the custom filter. And on the tasks, we're going to look for the list it belongs to. And then on that list, we're going to look for the owner. And in that owner, we're going to make sure that it is the requesting user, is self-true. And once again, I'll just throw it in here. IsSelfTrue is just an alias for essentially created by ID equals, and then a dynamic variable logged in user ID. Exact same thing, much more simply written as isSelf equals true. And we could say isSelf equals false if that's relevant to your use case. So I'm going to take that, copy it, save it, and add it to the task table over here. Cool. So for the simple use case, we've literally accomplished it at this point. This means that now if you have, let's imagine that we log into our task management front end. I log in as one of the users. I start hitting the API. It doesn't matter if there's a filter applied to that, if they say show us all the records or anything like that. These roles will be enforced and only return the data that's relevant to that authenticated user through the roles and permissions that we just set up. As long as, of course, the user is attributed the user role. If they have no role, they're going to have no permissions. They're not going to get anything back. Cool. Now, let's go to the next use case. As I'm sure that if you're familiar with 8-Base or familiar with software, this is kind of bread and butter for you. Now, the next use case that we want to accommodate is, okay, I've been using the Supertask backend as the single instance, single tenant user, and I realized it was super valuable that I wanted to give access to my friends. So then I made a single instant multi-tenant application to where now my friends can log in and do their tasks. But now one of my friends says, hey, this thing's so great. I want to bring it to my company. I want us to be able to, at my company level, collaborate on tasks and create lists. And I want that tenant record to be my company, to which the company actually has many users and no longer is the user the tenant. Cool. So let's now take that next step of creating the data model needed and then the relationship or the roles and permissions that are required for that type of enablement. We go back to data. And now I'm going to create a new table. I'm going to create a table called, I'm going to call it tenant for the sake of example, or tenants. We could call it company, groups, whatever we want to call it. Projects doesn't matter. Tenants will work though. All right. And we're just going to give a tenant a name because we can. And I'm going to create my first tenant record in my database called company or Big Co. Big Co is now using our tenant or our task management application. Cool. And I'll do another one called Small Co. And remember, we don't want Big Co to see Small Co's data. That would be catastrophic for our business, our up-and-coming task management startup. So what we want to be able to do here is make sure that we are securely permissioning or securely scoping all the data that belongs to Big Co or Small Co only to Big Co or Small Co. So let's go back to our schema. The first thing that we're going to do is build a relationship between the tenant and the user table. Now, remember, a tenant is like the company, so a tenant is going to have many users. And we also want to make sure that the resources within that tenant are shared by that tenant. Right? So that means that the users at the company can see the list that people are working on and collaborate on the tasks and whatnot. So no longer does our paradigm of a user has their own lists really work. Now, of course, we could create an application where a user can have their own lists and the company lists. This is all possible, but for the sake of simple example, we're just going to say that now the company has the lists and only if you work at the company can you see those lists and work on tasks, stuff like that. So here we're going to say that a company or a tenant has many users. That's totally fine. And a user belongs to a tenant. Now, once again, we can make that mandatory if we want to. I'm just not going to do it for now. Once again, if we needed to say that a user can belong to multiple tenants, that's possible as well. In this case, we're just going to say one account, one tenant for a user. So first, we're going to create that relationship. Now I'm going to go back to my lists here. And I'm going to say that I'm going to delete this owner relationship. Actually, I'm going to leave it. I've changed my mind. All I'm going to do now is I'm going to say that the list belongs to a tenant and an owner. And a tenant can have multiple lists. Perfect. and a tenant has list. Okay, cool. So now we have this tenant record. Now what we want to do is we want to make sure that there's two ways that you can read a list, right? We're actually going to dice it up here. Well, the first way that you can read a list is either if you are the owner or if you belong to the tenant which that list belongs to. Then the only way you're going to be able to update a list or a task that belongs to that list is if you're the owner, right? So if you're part of the company, you can read all the lists and the tasks, but only if you're the owner can you actually perform updates. Let's establish that now. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my list here. Even though we're not running these queries, it's just for the sake of example, it's healthy. And for the tenant, we're going to say that this list, Sam's list, belongs to BigCo. Cool. So Sam is the owner, and the list belongs to BigCo for which Sam works. All right, now let's go back to our role. Now, yeah, we'll use the user role. We'll just keep working with the user role here. Okay, so when it comes to our lists, right, once again, we're saying that as a user, you can create the lists, but which ones can you read? So first off, we can say that, well, if you're the owner of the list, you can read it. Cool, that makes perfect sense. But remember, we also want to now add that, well, maybe you're not the owner, but maybe you work for the same company as the owner, and that list belongs to that company. So what we're going to do here is we're going to open up new brackets and do an or. So paste that right back in there. Got to get a little better formatter in here. There we go. So the first condition that would allow you to read the list is whether you're the owner. And then the second one is we're going to look through that tenant relationship back to the users table. Remember, we're tying this back to the authenticated user, right? So we're going to say here, okay, well, does this list belong to a tenant that has users where, well, one second. Let me try that again. I think I may have gotten the wrong relationship type on there. So I'm just going to save that really quickly. Go back in here, tenant users, allow multiple tenants per user. Oh, allow multiple users per tenant. I had it backwards. Excuse me. Cool. Now it's set up. So now multiple users per tenant, not the other way around. So now when I go back to app services, I go to my user, go to my lists, come some filter, and I go in there. And now when I add that back, cool. I'm only allowing lists to be read that belong to a tenant that has users, of which one of the users is self. Essentially saying, if you belong to the tenant to which the list belongs, then you can read this list. And once again, like last time, I'm going to copy this and save it. And now our lists are good. So let's go over that update. And here, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to copy it over. But like we said last time, we don't want you to be able to update the list. Only if you're the owner can you update the list. However, let's think of this. Let's think of the example of what if you transferred ownership to another tenant, right? So maybe in this scenario, you may have transferred a list. There's like a feature where you can transfer the list to another company, right? In that scenario, if you're still the owner, you're technically seeing data that you shouldn't be seeing. So what we're going to do here is instead of saying or, we're going to say and. So in this scenario, we're pretty much saying, hey, you can only update the list if you are the owner and you belong to the tenant that the list belongs to. So kind of a double validation there. I'm going to copy this, save it, and we're good on the list. Let's do the same thing for the tasks. So here, we're going to say, hey, you can read the tasks if the task belongs to a list that belongs to a tenant which has users of which some or any of them, we can think of that word in many contexts, is you. Awesome. And save. And then once again, we're going to do the exact same thing for the task custom filter for update. However, here we're going to say that if the task belongs to a list of which you are a tenant. Actually, we just want to make sure that you are the tenant owner. So it's actually the same one as back there. Here, let me steal this one here again. So here for the tasks, once again, we want to make sure that you own the list if you're adding tasks to the list. Or we could just say that, you belong to the tenant of which the list belongs to. Once again, this is application specific, but you get the concept. So here what we're just going to say is that you have to belong to the tenant. The list has to belong to the tenant of which you belong to, and then you can collaborate on the list. And that makes sense. Cool. So I'm going to save that. And I think it pretties it up once we click. Yep, there we go. Awesome. So once again, at this point, we've accomplished this next level of our application to where now our data model is set up to only allow us to see certain records or perform certain actions on those records as long as the user that's making that request belongs to a tenant record of which those records also belong to. Now, that's a lot of the word record, so I apologize. However, we're going to take it up one last level for this video. Now, what we are assuming at this point is the permissions that are set per tenant are all the same. Meaning that, okay, well, if you can't, or every tenant doesn't want the non-owner to be able to update the list. Every tenant doesn't, or wants all their users to be able to read all their lists, right? However, as you start to build out more sophisticated applications or just have more demanding customers, those things start to change. And you have to be able to accommodate those types of changes. Once again, this is totally possible and in a pretty straightforward way. So what we're going to now do is come up with tenant level permissions. And here are how we're going to do that. So I'm going to create a new table here called tenant settings. And on this table, I'm going to say non-owners can update lists. And here I'm going to say that's a Boolean, or a switch, excuse me, and true false. And by default, let's just leave it as false. Say it's mandatory. Cool. Non-list owners can update tasks. And do the exact same thing here. And false. Let's leave it false again. By default, mandatory. Cool. Now we could go way down the rabbit hole with this, but this will satisfy what we're going to demonstrate here. Now, essentially what we're saying is that, okay, we're going to create two types of tenant level permissions. So pretty much as the administrator for the application, or of the customer administrator, excuse me, they will be able to permission whether or not the users in their tenant can or can't update tasks or lists depending on whether or not they are the owner of the list. Cool? So here what we're going to do is we're going to create two different scenarios. So first off is we're going to say that for big co, or actually for big co, we're going to leave it false, false. Okay. Oh, sorry. I forgot to do one thing here. We have to make the relationship between the tenant table and the tenant settings. And here what we're going to do is we're just going to do a one-to-one relationship and say that it is mandatory. A tenant setting, or the tenant settings needs to belong to a tenant, right? And that's because we only want one settings configuration per tenant. We don't want a tenant with multiple setting configurations which contradict one another. So here we're going to say that this is the tenant and the related field name is tenant settings. Cool. Awesome. So now when I go back here and let me update this guy. So when it comes to BigCo isn't letting their non-owners update anything. You have to be the owner to update it, even though you can see it if you're not an owner, because that's how we set up our application. Submit those changes. And we're going to add another one for SmallCo, where they let their users do everything. Awesome. So now we can see that these two tenants have these different settings, which are these values saved in the database. And now we want to tie those back into our roles and permissions engine to make sure that depending on not only the users that send in the query, but the tenant that they are sending that query on behalf of, we can think of it that way, that these permissions are taken into consideration. So now I'm going to go back to my app services and go to my user role. And I'm going to go to my lists update and custom filter. So now what we're going to check is a couple things. So the first one is we want to still maintain that if you are an owner, you can do the update. We don't want to touch that one. But now here we have to check two things. We have to check on the second one that not only do you belong to the tenant, but also that as a non-owner, if you are a non-owner, you have to, if you are a non-owner, the settings for that tenant need to be enabled for you to perform an update. Cool? So what we're going to do is we have that AND statement there. We're going to do a little bit extra nesting. Because remember, this is, we kind of don't want to touch it. So we're going to say an OR statement here, and then put that whole thing right in there. So that's scenario number one, right, which we already worked through. Now we're going to do scenario number two, which is two things have to check out for this one, because essentially in this case you're not the owner. So the first off is we're going to check that you belong to the tenant, which we have that one right here. So we'll drop that in there. And now the next one is we want to check that the tenant's permissions allow you as a non-owner to perform that update on the list. So if the list belongs to a tenant, which has tenant settings, of which non-owners can update lists, and if that equals true, you're good to go. If it equals false, you're not good to go. Copy that, save that, boom. We're just going to knock that one out. Now we're going to do the same thing for tasks. Custom filter for tasks. Once again, we're going to copy this whole thing here. And actually, no, we don't have to do the double predicate here because we're just dealing with we're just making sure that you belong to the first one. Or that the first one is valid, which is you are a tenant. You are a user of the tenant. It's a lot of wordplay. So we're just going to do the second check now. So does that task belong to a list, which belongs to a tenant, which has tenant settings, of which non-list owners can update the tasks? If that equals true, you're good to go. Save that. And once again, we've updated our permissions accordingly to now accommodate our final scenario, which is not only do you belong to a tenant, but that tenant has tenant level settings, which the roles and permissions engine is taking into account when scoping the data it's returning or when permissioning the operation that you are sending to the API. Cool. So I hope you found this video valuable, interesting, thought-provoking. There's a lot of different ways that you can take this. However, what it does is it kind of gives you a little bit of a foundation on how you can start to think about roles and permissions and data model really working together to create those more, call it sophisticated scenarios for the applications that you're building. So thank you again for watching. If you have any questions, please leave comments, reach out in the 8base community, Looking forward to hearing from you and looking forward to also seeing you in future videos. Take care.